the wholesome reader here again. Continuing with Father to Nobody's Children, Chapter 6, The Young Man with the Lantern. In his early years, while he was young and unmarried, Bernardo kept very odd hours. At the time when most people were going to bed, he would be lighting a lamp and putting on his hat and coat to begin his nightly quest. In back alleys, under bridges, behind sales booths in the marketplace, anywhere a small child could hide, Bernardo would wander about, shining his light. This earned him the reputation in the neighborhood as the young man with the lantern. Tramping through dark streets in the worst areas of London was not the safest thing a man could do. But Bernardo trusted that his master's angels were keeping watch, and he never suffered serious harm. One night a gang attacked him, taking his hat, his coat, his pocket watch and chain, his fountain pen, and all his money. As the thieves ran off, Bernardo knew it would be a waste of time to chase them, so he continued his search for children. A few moments later, one of the robbers met him, and, to his surprise, returned everything. "We begs your pardon, sir," the thief said with a smile. "Had we knowed ye was Dr. Bernardo, we would never touched ye." Apparently the gang had found Bernardo's name on some of his belongings, and even in that rough neighborhood his reputation commanded respect. His reputation wasn't always an asset, however. Late one night Bernardo stepped into a doss house, a cheap, filthy boarding house where the lodgers often slept 3 or more to a bed. He was immediately recognized by a young girl who quickly called to her friends, "Here's the bloke who's taken away our pals." A while before Bernardo had persuaded a group of boys to leave this doss house and enter a home for young men run by a friend of his. Little did he know that it would separate the boys from their girlfriends. Suddenly the doctor found himself surrounded by a pack of angry teenage girls who lost no time in taking out their revenge on him. They pulled his hair, slapped his face, tore his clothes, and pushed him down. Once they had him on the floor, several of the girls held him down while others kicked and stepped on him. It took him some time to break away from the mob of wild females, but he finally got to his feet and ran outside. Out in the safety of the street, he inspected the damage. His glasses were broken, his clothes were torn to shreds, and he had bruises all over his body. Though it was probably one of the most humiliating experiences of his life, Bernardo took it in stride. In fact, he even wrote about the incident in the Mission's magazine and included every embarrassing detail. Another example of Bernardo's ability to laugh at himself was the story he told of spending the night in the doss house. After visiting so many of these filthy places, he was curious. What was it like to sleep overnight in one? He was determined to find out. His guide in this adventure was Mick Farrell, a spunky little 13-year-old who claimed to have slept in most of the doss houses in East London. Mick said he knew of one place that had swell chaps as regulars, where for 4 pence, a very small amount of money, a person would be given a bed with lily-white sheets that was fit for a king. Bernardo knew that if he really wanted to experience the doss house life, he had to look the part. So for a few days he went without shaving. After smearing his face and hands with dirt, he put on a battered felt hat, a red handkerchief, an old coat, and some torn trousers. A piece of rope for a belt completed the disguise. Soon Mick had led Bernardo down a narrow, foul-smelling street to a grimy building several stories high. Above the door was a sign reading, "Beds for single men, 4 pence." After some light-hearted conversation with the man who ran the place, the pair were directed to beds 17 and 18, where Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, where Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, always sleeps when he wants to be fashionable, the manager said with a laugh. Their beds were in a room with over 30 others, mostly occupied by boys between 10 and 17. The smell was unbelievable, and the lily-white sheets were a dirty yellow. None of this seemed to matter to Mick, who quickly undressed and hopped into bed, snuggling down with a contented sigh. "This is what I calls a proper doss," he declared, "and no mistake." Before he dropped off to sleep, he warned Bernardo to hide his clothes under his pillow, or they would get stolen. What had begun as an adventure now seemed to be a foolish idea. Bernardo didn't know if he had the stomach to lie down in that filthy bed. Finally, his weariness overcame his disgust, and he crawled between the grimy yellow sheets. After nodding off for a while, Bernardo wrote later that he awoke suddenly out of a horrible dream in which he felt pricking pins all over my body. Imagine his suspense to find that the painful sensations continued after he woke. The gaslight was still on, so Bernardo could see that his hands and arms were covered with angry red sores. Alarmed, I sat up in bed, Bernardo continued in the retelling of his story. The simple fact is that the sheet was almost brown with moving insects, which seemed to regard my body as their rightful property. The room was infested with bedbugs. The insects continued to bite until Bernardo was in agony. He couldn't stand it any more. In desperation, he shook Mick awake and cried, get up at once. I must go out or I shall go mad." "Why, 'tain't nothing," Mick replied groggily, after Bernardo pointed out the army of hungry bugs. "I've seen 'em far worse. There were twice as many." Bernardo was in no mood to argue. After persuading Mick to get dressed, he rushed outside and took several deep breaths of fresh air. Then he hurried home and took a hot bath. When he looked in the mirror, he was shocked at his swollen red face. "None of my friends would have recognized the face I saw reflected there," Bernardo wrote. 3 weeks elapsed before I was in a state to be visible. It may seem hard to believe, but Bernardo often had to talk children into leaving the cold, hard life of the street and coming to his orphanage. Most of the homeless children he met had been mistreated by parents or other adults, and they didn't trust him. Besides, even though they were often hungry and cold, the street urchins enjoyed the freedoms they had. It was the only life that most of them knew, and they couldn't imagine anything better. But Bernardo could be persuasive. And as word got around about how persuasive he was, some of the Doss House owners began to see him as a threat to their business. There was one Doss House that Bernardo particularly wanted to visit, a very bad one in the Drury Lane district known as Thieves' Kitchen. The name fit the place because it was a notorious hideout and training ground for young criminals. Bernardo had tried for years to enter, but the manager, a big, rough-looking fellow, kept a close watch on the door. He knew who Bernardo was, and whenever the medical student passed at the entrance, he would growl, "Go about your business." But one night, that all changed. Bernardo was walking past the Thieves' Kitchen, and the manager approached him with an anxious look on his face. One of the regular lodgers was sick with a fever, and the burly man was afraid that if it was contagious, it could ruin his business. "Could you examine him, doctor?" he asked respectfully. It was a chance to enter the forbidden lair, and Bernardo jumped at it. His patient, as well as most of the lodgers, was in his early teens, and the fever was nothing serious. Bernardo insisted, however, that the boy must remain in bed for 2 weeks, with frequent visits from his physician. As Bernardo began coming daily to the boy's bedside, he kept his eyes and ears open and learned a few of the secrets of the Thieves' Kitchen. For one thing, the rumors were all too true. Most of the boys were professional lifters, pickpocketers. A brisk business was being done in stolen goods at the house. Most of the boys could not read or write. One evening he brought a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin to read aloud to his patient, and discovered that he immediately had the attention of nearly everyone in the place. Once he realized this, he read the book at every visit, coming later at night when almost all the boys were present. One night Bernardo noticed a tall, good-looking teenager and asked about him. "Why, that's Punch," one boy replied. "He's the king of the lifters, he is. Lifts more than a dozen regular chaps, and he's never been caught." Bernardo wasn't sure what to think of that, but he noticed that Punch sat spellbound as he read the story. After several visits, Bernardo finished the first book and began reading The Pilgrim's Progress. Punch remained fascinated. The 2 weeks passed, and the patient was fully recovered. The boys were disappointed when they learned that the little man in the spectacles would no longer be coming by to read to them. But Bernardo had an answer. If they came to live at his home, they could learn to read for themselves. Several boys wanted to be taken in at once, but Punch resisted, even though he obviously wanted to learn to read. Later, after he had learned more about the boy's past, Bernardo understood his reluctance. Punch had never known his parents. He grew up in a government-run poorhouse, where he was very ill-treated. At the age of 9, he ran away. For a while he tried to earn a living selling matches on the street, but he got tired of sleeping out in the cold and being hungry all the time. And one night, in a doss house, he met an older boy who taught him the art of pickpocket. Before long, he had surpassed his teacher and earned his reputation as the king of the lifters. Bernardo was patient, but continued to gently press for a decision. Finally, Punch agreed to live at the home, but only on one condition. If after a year he still could not read, he would be free to leave. Though Bernardo did not normally allow a child to set conditions on admission, in this case he agreed. However, Bernardo thought it best to keep a close eye on the boy, so he gave Punch little odd jobs to do, such as tidying up the office. This gave Bernardo many opportunities to talk with the young thief and learn more about the boy's background. For the most part, he enjoyed his conversations with Punch, but it concerned him that the boy seemed to have no sense of right and wrong. To the king of the lifters, stealing was just a game. In fact, he was proud of it. One day, when Punch was bragging about his great skill, Bernardo told him sternly to stop telling such tall tales. The boy didn't say anything, but went back to work. About 20 minutes later, he asked the doctor what time it was. Bernardo reached for his pocket watch, but it was gone, along with the watch chain, his wallet, penknife, and handkerchief. With a grin, Punch lifted a sheet of paper on a nearby desk to reveal the missing items. Now Bernardo realized how serious the problem was. Preaching to Punch about stealing wasn't working. Perhaps it was time to try a new approach. James, Punch's closest friend at the home, was known for his honesty. Dr. Bernardo pointed out that if James knew about Punch's stealing, it could destroy their friendship. A curious look came over the boy's face at this comment, but he didn't respond. When Punch came into Bernardo's office a few days later, it was obvious he had been crying. With a sad look on his face, he insisted that he be allowed to leave the home at once. When Bernardo asked why, the boy's sad face immediately turned to one of angry accusation. "You've been talking about me, haven't you?" he cried. "James has called me a thief." In a gentle voice, Bernardo assured Punch that he hadn't said a word to James. At that, the dam of stubbornness broke in the boy's heart, and the doctor's office became an altar as the two knelt and prayed. From that day on, Punch lost all pride in his thievery, and his past life was over. By the time the 1-year deadline was up, not only could Punch read, but he asked to stay on so that he could learn the shoemaking trade. Within 2 years, he was teaching other boys. When Bernardo heard about an opening for an expert shoemaker to start a training program at another boys' home, he recommended Punch. Surprisingly, Punch was greatly upset by the offer. "You want to get rid of me?" After Bernardo assured him that he would be missed, Punch began to see the advantages of the opportunity he was being given. He took the job and was an excellent example to the boys he taught. This one-time thief became one of Bernardo's greatest success stories. In the meantime, the East End Juvenile Mission, now popularly known as Dr. Bernardo's Homes, was growing at an amazing rate. The decision to admit any truly needy child, coupled with the doctor's nighttime habit of seeking them out, created a flood of children at the mission's doors. Bernardo and his staff managed the problem as best they could. Part of the secret to taking care of so many children was an efficient schedule. The day began at 6 a.m. with morning prayer. Between 3 square meals there were 2 school periods, training in a trade or profession, physical exercises and sports, time for reading or meditation, and household chores, making beds, sweeping and scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and other duties. While no destitute child ever refused admission remained the rule of Dr. Bernardo's homes, the staff was careful to make sure the boys were truly homeless. A background check was made of every child that was presented for admission to the home. In some cases, long-lost relatives or friends were found who were willing to take the child in. But for those who had no one at all who cared for them, Bernardo always found a place. When he had no room in his orphanage, he often could find good Christian families to take in a child. Some of these families received help from the mission to pay for the extra mouth to feed. Today, there are many agencies that conduct this kind of foster parent program, but in Bernardo's day, it was a completely new idea. To provide more room in his orphanage, Bernardo picked out some of the healthiest and most well-behaved of the older children to start a new life in Canada. Canada was still very sparsely populated in the late 1800s, and these older children were welcome additions to the growing country. Despite these and other programs, the number of children Bernardo kept under his roof continued to grow. But why were there so many needy children? Lord Shaftesbury was bothered by the question, and asked Bernardo in 1871 to review his records to discover the main cause of homelessness among the children in his care. What Bernardo learned from that bit of homework shocked him and was the beginning of a new field of ministry. And that is the end of chapter 6.